Hi guys, it's Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Marc Zicree of Space Command. And I promised that I would do another in a series of Ray Bradbury videos based on my friendship with Ray Bradbury and things he told me that were not told in general to other people. So this is one of these. And today I'll be talking about the further Martian Chronicles, also known as Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars. And just to preface this all, many of you, of course, know that one of Ray's great books is The Martian Chronicles. And I learned from Ray and also from another friend of mine, Norman Corwin, how that book came about. Norman Corwin was the great writer of radio. He was the guy that basically Ray Bradbury and Rod Serling wanted to grow up to be. And essentially, Norman was someone, well, basically, he was the one who would write an entire series of radio plays. And one of his great radio plays was called On a Note of Triumph, which was when we won the war in Europe. He was commissioned to write an hour-long drama talking about what that meant, what we were going to do from there, and it was broadcast simultaneously on all the networks with no commercials. So when Ray Bradbury started to get well known, he wrote a letter to Norman Corwin saying, if you he basically sent his short stories along, a book of his short stories, and said, if you like these half as much as I love your radio plays, I'd love to take you out for coffee. And Norman responded to him saying, you're not taking me out to coffee, I'm taking you out for dinner. And they became extremely good friends. This is in the late 1940s, and just as Ray was starting to gain a little bit of a name for himself as a short story writer. Well, Ray at that time, he would basically sit down on a Monday, write an entire short story in one sitting. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, he'd polish it. Friday, he'd mailed it off to his agent, Don Congdon in New York. Ray was living in Los Angeles. And then start all over again on Monday. And he'd be writing 50 stories a year and selling many of them. And that was what he was doing, and taking 2 weeks off to presumably go on vacation or have a break. And that was his life. And he also wrote a short story called Ela. There was a story of a man landing on Mars and a Martian woman who's in an unhappy marriage who has a telepathic dream of meeting a handsome captain from Earth. And it's a terrific short story. And when Ray wrote that, Norman Corwin read it and said, this is very, very good. You should write more Mars stories. So Ray started writing Mars stories, and he would sit down and he would just kind of spin out variations on a theme. So he might write several Mars stories that were about first contact between Earth and Mars, different rocket ships from Earth landing on Mars and having different things happen to them, or early colonization stories, and so forth. And he wrote many, many of these stories. But then what happened was his wife Maggie got pregnant with their first daughter, and she wouldn't be able to work anymore once the baby was born. And Ray knew that he would have to increase his earnings, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to make a go of it. So Norman Corwin at that point was living in New York and said to Ray, come to New York and I'll take you around and I'll introduce you to the different book editors, and maybe you can get a book deal out of that. So Ray took the Greyhound bus from Los Angeles to New York and basically stayed at the YMCA. And Norman introduced him to a number. Norman was very, very famous at that point. He was writing for CBS. He also wrote a movie called Lust for Life that was about Vincent van Gogh. It starred Kirk Douglas, and it was Norman was nominated for an Oscar for that. I knew Norman through many of the later decades of his life. He died at 101 just a few years ago. An amazing writer, a brilliant man. I highly recommend checking out his work as well. You can go online and listen to his radio plays. Just Google them, Norman Corwin. And so one of the editors that Norman introduced Ray to was an editor named Walter Bradbury, no relation to Ray. And he met with Ray, and Ray said, well, I have these short stories. I'd like to do a collection of short stories in book form. And Walter Bradbury said, well, Mr. Bradbury, we don't publish short story collections. They really can't. You really can't sell them. They're not very lucrative. But maybe you could take some of these Mars stories you've been doing and weave them together into a narrative that would stand as a book. So why don't you go back to the Y tonight and see what you can do? So Ray went back to the YMCA that night, and unbeknownst to himself, he'd actually been writing a narrative of these stories. And so that night he worked up the outline, because some of the Mars stories were about various expeditions from Earth landing and encountering Martians. Then basically the humans colonize Mars, and the Martians catch a disease from the Earthlings, just like the Indians caught a disease from the Europeans. They're basically decimated, and then nuclear war happens on Earth. The human population is decimated, and the last few survivors from Earth go back to Mars to survive and become the new Martians. And so he wove that basic thread together that night in the YMCA. The next morning he met with Walter Bradbury, and Walter Bradbury said, great, I'll buy this. And he said, you got anything else that could make a book? And Ray said, well, I wrote a story called The Illustrated Man about a tattooed man at a carnival whose tattoos come alive. Maybe they could come alive and be different stories. There'd be like a rocket ship and so forth. And so that would be the book. It'd be this illustrated man whose tattoos come alive. And Walter Bradbury said, sold. And so in one meeting, Ray had sold 2 books. And so he got paid the advances, and he took the train home in triumph rather than the bus. And he came back, and the Martian Chronicles and the Illustrated Man were published in 1950, and they were very, very successful, and Ray's career was off and running in earnest. So, of course, I read the Martian Chronicles as a kid, really loved it, and it's one of my favorite books. I have a first edition of it somewhere back there behind me, and that Ray signed. And as Ray and I became friends in the last decade or so of his life, Ray and I were talking about these Mars stories, and Ray mentioned that he had a number of other Mars stories that were not in the Martian Chronicles, and we started talking, and I came to realize there were about 22 of them, and they followed the same chronology as the Martian Chronicles, but they weren't in the Martian Chronicles, because basically Ray would sit down and he might write 8 stories about first contact of these different expeditions from Earth landing on Mars, and in the Martian Chronicles there's only 4 of them. So there's another 4 that aren't in the Martian Chronicles, and there's other stories about the first colonies, human colonies on Mars, and so forth. And there's a great story called Dark They Were and Golden-Eyed about the colonists, the human colonists, being left on Mars when there's a nuclear war on Earth. Most of the humans go back to Earth to defend the home planet, and the colonists who stay on Mars in that story basically become these Martians. They turn into Martians. Mars embraces them. It's a great short story. So initially I had the idea with Ray of doing a book, and this is actually the proposal. This is the book itself. It's the Further Martian Chronicles, the Other Martian Chronicles, and I basically put this together, and I interviewed Ray about those stories. I interviewed him on audio, so I have those audio recordings talking about all of the Mars stories in his career and his life. And I wove this all together, and I wrote a long introduction, and I put all the stories together in the order that I thought they should go, that followed the chronology of the Martian Chronicles. And I proposed this as a book. And eventually this evolved into a book that was published as the Complete Martian Chronicles, that included the Martian Chronicles and the uncollected Mars stories and unpublished Mars stories. And I actually wrote the introduction to the unpublished Mars stories for that collection. It's a rare book. One can find it, and it's a big, heavy tome in a slipcase, and it's quite a wonderful book. But once that was going to be published, I realized that there was another life for those stories, and I suggested this to Ray, and I said, well, why don't you let me do an 8-hour miniseries that we would call Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars, and I would script it and produce it, and it would basically weave together the narrative of these 22 stories, so it would be a companion to the Martian Chronicles. And Ray said, great. And so he gave me the rights, and I reached out to my friend Michael Nankin, who was one of the great directors on Battlestar Galactica. And the idea was that Michael Nankin and I would produce it, Michael would direct it, I would write it. And I sat down and I wrote an outline for an 8-hour miniseries called Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars. And I wove all of these stories together into a single narrative. And it included Dark They Were and Golden-Eyed and many other wonderful stories, the Strawberry Window, etc., etc. And we took it out and pitched it. And we could not sell it. We could not sell it. And I was very disappointed. And I thought, my God, this is such a no-brainer for this to get made, because it would be so wonderful. And so, but that was the reality of the business. And so I still have the outline, and as you saw, I still have the proposal for the complete book, which is actually very different from the Complete Martian Chronicles in that it goes into much more depth on this material. And at some point, I may post the outline that I did because I'm very proud of it. I'd still love to do that project, but that was really sort of what ended my desire to pitch to the networks and the studios. That led directly to Space Command because if I thought to myself, if they don't get it, Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars would be wonderful. And one of the questions they would ask me is, they would say, well, but Ray Bradbury's Mars is not the same as the Mars that we're seeing on through the Curiosity rover and so forth. And I said, well, yes, but Oz isn't really over the rainbow either. This is a fantasy construct. This is a great fantasy realm and fantasy work, and it doesn't have to be a literal story. It doesn't have to be exactly what's on Mars that we're seeing through the NASA photographs, and they just couldn't quite get that. And so this is another project I haven't mentioned the fact that Ray Harryhausen, another one of Ray's dear friends, and I teamed up around that same time to do his unproduced projects, and I actually outlined a sequel to Jason and the Argonauts called Jason in the Underworld. So I'll do another Mr. Sci-Fi video about my relationship and working relationship with Ray Harryhausen and Ray Bradbury's friendship with him as another video sometime soon. But for now, it was basically I just wanted to cover this story and this narrative about Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars because it was wonderful to work on. It was wonderful material to get into, and Ray was very gracious in letting me have this material for over a year to take out and try and set up. And but I realize now that I could reach out directly to my audience, and so maybe someday after I do Space Command, I will reach out to the audience again and do Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars because I would love to. It's just a shame that Ray won't be here to see it realized. The other person I brought aboard was Ian McCaig, who designed Darth Maul and Queen Amidala, who's worked with me on many projects, and he was going to be the designer of Ray Bradbury's Lost Mars. So that would have been yet another marvelous thing. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you and let you know about this project and how dear Ray was and how amazing he was as a writer. If you haven't read the Martian Chronicles, do. It's a great piece of work. It really holds up. And so until next time, this is Mr. Sci-Fi, Marc Zicree of Space Command. Like, share, do all the things you do, subscribe, and we'll talk to you again real soon. Bye-bye.